If you spend enough time on TikTok, you're gonna come across stories that kind of just stop you mid-scroll. And not because they're wild in some sensational way, but because they're complex but relatable and usually a mess, in some ways like unsettling. Recently, a creator whose real name is Kendra Hilty has been sharing this series about falling in love with her psychiatrist over the span of a 4-year treatment process that was happening remotely. Now, in case you're not on the internet as much as some of us, let me fill you in a little bit here. She's claiming that her relationship became emotionally complicated and even manipulative. And more recently, she's turned to an AI chatbot that she's named Henry for emotional support. Now, I wanted to cover this because this isn't just some gossip headline. This is a really interesting sort of intersection, if you will, of a couple of important topics. Number one, erotic transference. Number two, the importance of professional boundaries in therapy. And then also our sort of growing willingness to form emotional bonds with AI. I want to unpack this story not to pass judgment on Kendra or her psychiatrist, but to explore what the situation, I think, teaches us about people trying to just basically navigate connection in an increasingly digital world as both clinicians and patients. So we'll talk about in this video what erotic transference is, how ethical boundaries and therapy are supposed to work, why AI chatbots like Henry might actually be a bit of a lifeline in moments of emotional rupture, and sort of what happens when situations like this spill into the public sphere. So my goal here is to unpack the clinical and ethical layers of the situation and maybe help you reflect on how you would respond if you found yourself in a similar situation, whether it be in the clinician seat, the patient seat, or somewhere in between. Okay, in therapy, the first thing I want to put out on the table is that it's very common that some strong feelings are going to come up. Oftentimes very deep, complicated, and sometimes even romantic feelings towards a therapist. This happens. Now, when this happens, this is clinically what we call transference. That's basically when past relationships, attachments, especially those early attachment relationships, sort of get transferred or projected onto the clinician. Now, most of the time, transference isn't romantic. It usually presents itself as sort of seeing the therapist as kind of a parental figure, a trusted older sibling, or sort of a safe authority in a way that our clients didn't have growing up. But there's a particular form of transference we call erotic transference, which is what Kendra's story taps into. And that's basically where you start to experience romantic and even sexual feelings towards your therapist. Now, when this happens, this doesn't mean that the therapy is broken, that the clinician's doing something wrong per se, or that the client is doing anything wrong. In fact, this can actually be a valuable moment in treatment because it can reveal a lot about unmet needs, attachment wounds, and patterns in other relationships. Now, that said, erotic transference does come with a higher risk of boundary confusion, especially if the therapist responds in ways that are inconsistent, that are overly personal or emotionally enmeshed. Now, from Kendra's account, this is kind of how she describes her therapist, that sometimes he was warm and validating, and at other times cold and distant. And she even makes it a point to say that this unpredictability was what sort of drew her in, almost like she's chasing the warmth. This intermittent reward cycle is really addicting for us. It's a really powerful psychological hook, if you will. It's kind of the same reason why gambling can be so addictive. Now, for a therapist, this is the exact moment to slow down and be very intentional. In these situations, we basically have to name what's happening, help the clients process what they're feeling, and set very compassionate yet very clear boundaries. And we have to do this even though knowing that for our clients, this can be incredibly painful. Like, it basically is a form of rejection, or it's not meant to be, but it feels that way for some clients, even when, as the clinicians, we are oftentimes acting in the interest of the client's well-being and protection. But I'd say overall, the key thing to remember here is that erotic transference is a natural, normal human phenomenon. In fact, I'd be willing to bet that a number of you watching this, if you've been through therapy enough, maybe have had this happen to you. It's not the client's fault that it comes up. It's not inherently harmful either. Really, the important thing to know is that the harm or the healing can come from the way that it's handled. Now, there's another thing to point out here, that whenever we're talking about erotic transference, there's another layer that is always at play here, and that is our ethical codes. In mental health care, we aren't just operating from a place of good intentions. We actually have strict ethical guidelines, codes, that are meant to protect the clients, the clinicians, and protect the integrity of the therapeutic process. The American Psychiatric Associations, and similarly the APA for psychologists, makes it very clear under no circumstances are sexual or romantic relationships with current clients acceptable, period. Like, cannot go there. And even once therapy ends, there are still some pretty strict rules that often require multiple years before any non-therapeutic personal contact can occur. And even then, it's still discouraged because of the possibility of a lingering power imbalance. Why? Because therapy isn't a friendship and it isn't romantic. The relationship is inherently asymmetrical. As therapists, we have access to clients' most vulnerable experiences. We know how to read their emotions, and we are in a position of authority. That's unfair. And that power imbalance makes it impossible to have a truly equal, consensual romantic relationship. And even subtle actions like oversharing personal stories or responding inconsistently to a client's emotional bids can muddy the waters and actually result in some therapeutic harm. And this is tricky because there are some clinicians like myself who will share personal stories, and that's often because I want my clients to know that I can relate, I can understand where they're coming from. And there are some clinicians who won't do that, specifically because they don't want to run the risk of any of the things that I just mentioned. Now, in Kendra's account, she actually says that her psychiatrist would sometimes share personal details, sometimes would be warm, and then sometimes would be cold. And that hot and cold dynamic in therapy can actually amplify attachment wounds and destabilize clients. Now, from the psychiatrist's perspective, what Kendra's describing might not match his experience at all. And to be fair, the only public record we have of any of this is her account. But even so, the principle still stands. Once erotic transference is named or suspected, it is the clinician's duty to maintain or sometimes even tighten clear boundaries. Now, again, this could mean explicitly naming what's happening with the client processing it. It could mean seeking some additional consultation or supervision. And in some cases, it can mean transferring the client to a different provider if the therapeutic relationship can't be repaired. And it's not about punishment. It really is about ensuring the client gets the best possible care without running the risk of causing further harm. And when these boundaries fail, the fallout can be huge. Let me tell you, I have personally sat in on hearings where misconduct has happened. So not only can our clients end up feeling betrayed, but the therapists can face disciplinary action and even lose their license. And especially in the age of social media, there is the risk of the entire situation being broadcast, often without full context, which is exactly what's happening here. Now, if you've been following the story, you already know what comes after this. But in case you don't, after basically ending her relationship with her psychiatrist, Kendra turns to ChatGPT for companionship, specifically a customized version she's named Henry. She describes Henry as a romantic partner, a confidant, and even a source of emotional regulation. Now, on the surface, this might sound a little unusual, but actually, if we zoom out, it's part of a much bigger trend. And it's important to point out that humans have always formed emotional connections to non-human entities, pets, fictional characters, and even inanimate objects. Just to kind of briefly share, working with the autistic community, sometimes I will learn about what's called tunaphilia, where some of my clients would form romantic connections and feelings with their cartoon characters, their favorite cartoon characters. Now, one of the most painful things for them is that cartoon character couldn't really reciprocate. But now consider AI, we have technology that can simulate back and forth conversation that feels personal, responsive, and emotionally attuned. And this makes it really easy to anthropomorphize, essentially assigning feelings, intentions, and personality to AI. Now, from a psychological standpoint, I would say that Henry is serving as an attachment figure for Kendra, someone she can turn to in distress that she sees as predictable, who never initiates rupture unless she wants it to, and basically is the things that she wanted from her relationship with her therapist, psychiatrist, and probably wanted from her past relationships where she was let down. For someone dealing with loss, rejection, or even boundary enforcement in therapy, that kind of consistency can really feel like a lifeline. But the problem here is that this chatbot isn't a person. It can't truly reciprocate, repair, or make decisions from a shared moral framework. The relationship is entirely shaped by the user's prompts and expectations. And while that can feel safer than human intimacy, it can also reinforce avoidance of kind of vulnerability in real-world situations and expect our relationships to be one-sided like that. In other words, Henry might be offering some comfort to Kendra right now, but he cannot challenge her in the way that human connection can. Now, I think this raises an interesting sort of clinical question or challenge for us, which is when our clients form these kinds of bonds with AI or cartoons or what have you, how do we meet them where they are without dismissing them or shaming them? Because for some, these connections are a temporary bridge. In other words, they help them stabilize until they can sort of re-engage with human connection. But for others, it can become a long-term substitute, sort of making it harder to tolerate the unpredictability and the needs of real people. And in Kendra's case, I would argue that Henry here isn't just a chatbot. He's part of a larger story of attachment, rupture, and repair. And I think it's worth asking what needs Henry might be meeting for her right now, and considering how we might help address these needs in a safe human therapeutic context. Now, one of the most striking and risky components of Kendra's story is how public she's made all of this. And not just in vague terms, but with really personal, specific details about her psychiatrist. And this is when it stops mattering if her account is completely accurate, partially accurate, or completely her own perspective, because once things are disclosed in a public nature like this, it has serious implications. First, there's the issue of safety for the clinician. This can cross into doxing, exposing identifying information that can lead to harassment, threats, or damage to the clinician's reputation. And for the client, this can also lead to long-term consequences. Once that story is out there, once the genie is out of the bottle, there's not really any putting it back in, and the internet tends to strip out a lot of the nuance. And when that happens, viewers tend to jump to their own conclusions without full context or hearing the other parties involved stories. And not only this, it changes the therapeutic frame. If a client goes public with their narrative during or even after the treatment, think about this. This is going to affect how future clinicians will approach the work. For instance, this is probably going to create a climate of fear, which is not going to be ideal for trust building. And for clinicians, it raises the importance of documentation, supervision, and clear, consistent boundary setting from the start. And look, either way, I do think we all need to consider that we sort of live in a culture where personal stories are becoming public commodities, which means that clinicians and clients alike really need to consider how it's not just about the therapeutic moment, but the possibility that these stories could be shared, reshaped, and magnified far beyond the therapy room. Look, at the end of the day, at the heart of this story, I think is something that we can all relate to, which is the desire to be understood, to be valued, and connected. Whether it's with a psychiatrist, an AI companion, or a TikTok audience, that longing shapes our decisions and our actions. For clinicians, I think Kendra's story is a reminder that erotic transference happens. It's not a sign of some clinical failure, but it's also a reminder that we need expertise and skills when it comes to setting boundaries with compassion. And for clients, this can also be a reminder that strong feelings towards a therapist are valid and worth exploring in a safe, respectful space. And for all of us, I think this story is a sneak peek into how technology is blurring the boundaries between human connection and simulation, if you will. So here's my question for you. If you found yourself in Kendra's position, experiencing strong feelings for your therapist, how would you want them to respond? And if you're a therapist, how would you respond if you learned that your client was developing a deep emotional attachment to AI? Now, I know this isn't a simple question, but I do think this is one worth sitting with because our answers, I think, reveal a lot about how we see trust, connection, and sort of the boundaries that keep those things safe. Let's keep the conversation going in the comments. And a quick side note, if you or someone you know is struggling with feelings that are overwhelming or confusing, reach out to a qualified mental health professional. And if that's with a mental health professional, don't be afraid to seek a consultation with a different mental health professional, because these moments don't have to be navigated alone. I'm Dr. Charles. As always, take care of each other out there. Thank you so much for watching, and we will see you at the next check-in.